Up until now, your web content has been static. There hasn't been a way for the end user to input data into your site. This is where forms come in. HTML forms are used to take user input. For example, they can be used to sign into an account, as you did when you visited WebDevTutorials. They can also be used to search for something on a website, or they can be used to change the content of the site. Most websites use forms. Forms can also take many different shapes and sizes. You can have forms that are only one input box, or you can have forms that span multiple pages. You can have input boxes, checkboxes, radio buttons, drop-down menus, buttons, and more. Let's take a look at implementing one. To make a form, use the form tag. The form tag has two required attributes, action and method. When you click the Submit button on a form, the values in that form, such as the username or the checkboxes, are sent to another page. This page is usually written in a scripting language like PHP. We'll talk more later about PHP, but PHP allows you to use the input collected in different ways. The location of this page is specified in the action attribute. The method attribute specifies the method in which the variables are sent. Two main methods exist, the get method and the post method. Have you ever looked at a URL and seen a question mark followed by a bunch of data? This is a form using the get method. Forms sent using the get method have all of their data set in key value pairs in the URL and are therefore not used for dealing with sensitive information because they can be cached or bookmarked. Get requests are mainly used to retrieve data. On the other hand, post requests are not visible in the URL. Post requests are extremely useful for dealing with information like passwords or for sending long text. So, either put a post or a get in the method attribute depending on the situation. Once inside the actual form, just line up all your inputs using the input tag. Then you have to decide what kind of input you'll use. The most commonly used is text. The text input creates a small box that lets users type inside it. Specify that the input will be a text by using the attribute type. Input type equals text. You can also set type to text or password. If you set it to password, then the text that user types in the box will be masked for security. You also need to set the name attribute. The name attribute specifies the name of every input in a form system. It is important to include a unique name attribute for every input because the name is how the PHP file manipulates the user input. If this input is for a username, then we can call the name username. Another common type of input is radio buttons. Radio buttons force the user to select only one option from an array of choices. To use a radio button, use input type equals radio, then set the name attribute to the name you wish for every radio button in the array. This will force the browser to only let the user select one radio button within the same name. Radio buttons also require the value attribute. Set a unique value to every radio input that describes the radio. Let's make a form that asks the user for their gender. Start with the form tag, the action attribute, and the method attribute. Then implement two input tags, setting the type to radio. Set the name for both to gender because we only want to let the user select one. Finally, set the value of the first to female and the value of the second to male. After the opening tag, write the words female and male. Notice that there is no closing input tag, so if you want to have the same option on a new line, we use the special break tag. What if we want to let the user select more than one option? We can use the checkbox input, which lets the user select 0 or more options. It is very similar to the radio type. Set the type of the input to checkbox, make the name the same name for one group, and the value to a unique description of the checkbox. Many other input types exist, all of which are used in very similar ways. For example, the file type prompts the user to pick a file. To conclude, let's make another form. We are a news company, and we want to let users sign up to receive a newsletter. We will need to take their name, their email address, the frequency in which they want to receive the newsletter, and the newsletter categories they wish to sign up for. Start by creating the actual form element. Use the form tag and specify the action attribute to the URL where we will send the form. The receiving form will add the user's name and subscription to a database. We also want to set the form to method post, since we are adding info to a database and not retrieving information. Don't forget to close the form at the end. Once inside the form, give a user a prompt to type their name. Use the input tag for the name field. Set the type to text and name to name. Then do the same for the email. Make a new line by using the BR tag. Email prompt, then the input with type text and name email. Next, let's set up the frequency button. We will want to let the user pick whether to get an email once per day or once per month. To do this, we'll use radio buttons. Input type equals radio, name equals frequency, and value equals daily. For the other radio button, we use name equals frequency and value equals weekly. We do this because every radio button should have the same name, but a different value. Don't forget to add some text next to the actual radio buttons. Finally, let's set up the categories. Users should be able to pick more than one category to subscribe to if they want, so we'll use input type equals checkbox. For each checkbox, use the same name, categories, but a different value. How about sport and politics? But what about when they've finished filling in the form? Then what happens? You need a button to submit the form. This is simple. Input type equals submit. When the user clicks on the submit button, the form will be sent to the URL in the action attribute. This is what the finished form looks like. Forms are relatively simple to implement. Just keep in mind the things we discussed in the video. Next lesson, we'll explore making tables in HTML.